Thank you to our show sponsors, RealAg on the Weekend, the Canola School, and FMC Pre-School. FMC Pre-School is an education and stewardship extension of FMC Canada with a firm mandate to bring educational value to you regarding proactive weed control and resistance management best practices. Learn more at fmcpreschool.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and loving watching all the commentary come in on just what kind of winter we're having across Canada. So if you are out there in the comments, let us know where you're watching from, where you're listening from. Would love to know. Yes, it is a chilly one here in Eastern Ontario and kind of has been. Producer Jay and I were chatting just before we went live that February is the longest short month. So we're in for a big doozy of a storm here later this week, and just seems to be the way it goes. All right. As always, here on the Agronomists, if you collect those CEU credits, make sure you head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Let us know you took in the show. We'll get those CEU credits to you. Now, tonight's conversation, one I'm very much looking forward to, and two brand new guests for this show, but certainly familiar names to many of you. So we'll bring them in tonight. We're going to talk about outsmarting weeds using herbicide layering. I've got Dr. Joe Ikley with NDSU and Rachel Evans with FMC. Rachel, I'll start with you. Welcome here. Based at Winnipeg, Are you avoiding frostbite? Let's start there.
It's really good to invest in a really good parka when you live in Winnipeg. So that's
Mhm.
rule number one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Rachel, what is your role with FMC? What keeps you busy?
So I am the technical sales manager for our Eastern Prairies region. So I cover Manitoba and Southern and Eastern Saskatchewan. And so in my role, I work with marketing, sales, R&D, but mostly and primarily just supporting the sales team and our customers with our FMC portfolio.
All right, and Dr. Joe Ikley from NDSU. So really, as a crow flies, not that far apart, the two of you, just very far from me. Joe, what do you focus on there at NDSU?
Yeah, so well, as a car drives, maybe rather than a crow flying, I'm about 3 hours south of where Rachel is at, and yeah, so I'm extension weed scientist for NDSU. So my role is weed control for every crop across the state of North Dakota except for sugar beet and potato, two crops that I don't have any responsibility for. But then on the research side of my appointment, my main focus is corn, soybean, and dry bean, dealing with the weeds that are most problematic in those three crops. But again, have to answer questions for about 20 different crops. So quite a
Mhm.
large geography to cover there.
Well, and there's a reason the two of you are on, is because while in Ontario a solid rotation is three crops, for where the two of you are, that would not be necessarily the most diverse by a long shot. You could have six crops in rotation, maybe more. So that of course brings up its own set of challenges. Lots of benefits to that as well. But tonight we're going to talk about some of those challenges and the types of strategies that we can use to try and outsmart some of these weeds. Now, maybe Joe, I'll start with you. With the work that you're doing, with the growers that you work with, the research you're doing, what would be sort of the top contenders for most problematic weeds that you're dealing with?
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and I will nominate two weeds that are broadleafs and two grass weeds. So the weeds that dominate my phone calls and conversations on the broadleaf side are kochia and water hemp. Then for the grasses, green foxtail. Some folks around this area will call it pigeon grass, but green foxtail and wild oat are the top two grass weeds that I deal with. Plenty of other contenders along the way, but mainly due to herbicide resistance within our cropping system, I'd call that my top four.
All right, Rachel, how does your list stack up? Similar differences?
Um, Definitely some differences, I guess, and honestly, just there's such a huge amount of variability just in the region that I cover, going from say like the Red River Valley all the way to Swift Current, right? That's
Hmm.
completely different cropping systems, but the common denominator across all of that land is kochia, hands down. And so that would be probably the number one. And then, secondary weeds could be the pigweed species in Manitoba, whether it's, red root, or, we've got more water hemp spreading. On the west side, group 2 resistant stinkweed be another one that dominates out there as well. So, and then wild oats, probably one that just sort of, again, in the grassy weeds, I would say, spreads across that entire area.
Hmm. Joe, I'll be honest, I've never heard it called pigeon grass before. Does green foxtail gets called pigeon grass?
Green and yellow foxtail, so they get lumped together. So that was a
Oh,
new one I learned when I
okay.
moved here. So just
Okay, so there you
one of those
go.
regional things.
I love learning stuff like that. Because of course I'd never know what that was. Yes, and Ray adds, if we're going to talk regional differences, Swift Current is also known as Speedy Creek. So if somebody asks you about Speedy Creek, that's what we mean. And Jim Hale's calling it kochia seasonal depression. That's right.
Yes, yes.
It is always kochia season. All right, and I mean, it's a problem weed that comes up on this show many times, and usually whenever we're talking herbicide strategies. Rachel, maybe from your perspective in the context of herbicide layering, um, why is it potentially a really good fit for kochia? What is it about kochia that makes it such a hard target?
I guess a few different things, right? One is that it germinates really early. So, there's been some research that's published as little as 50 growing degree days, that's 50, is enough to have kochia germinate. And so that means that it gets going really, really early in the springtime. And that's going to be, depending again where you are, a lot of times that's going to be way in advance of when our crops are getting seeded to introduce that crop competition. So, that's problem one, is that it germinates early. Problem two is that it can germinate for a long period of time. And that's probably something that other weeds have in common that, that we struggle to control, is just that duration of that germination period. So that's probably, top two, I guess, is we're trying to incorporate that soil applied herbicide to provide that, residual control early in the season.
Mm-hmm. So I've probably jumped ahead, and so I'm going to pull myself back here. I got really excited, everybody. Joe, let's back up a step. When someone uses the term herbicide layering, what are we actually talking about? Because I think we talk a lot about tank mixes, multiple effective modes of action, those sorts of things. But what is herbicide layering?
Yeah, so the way that we will use that term is essentially using a residual herbicide, so activity within the soil on weeds that have not yet germinated or are germinating at the time, and really trying to capture them in that germination phase. And so that means a few different things. When I think about that from a water hemp perspective, we want something at crop planting in the spring, and then about 4 weeks later, additional residual herbicide, because water hemp will germinate throughout the growing season, throughout the summer. As we kind of already alluded to with kochia, that layering idea may look at a fall application, getting residual on in this geography before we freeze up to catch that early flush of kochia. And then we know we need some more herbicide residual in the soil at planting, or maybe a little bit before or after planting. So it's really, rather than relying on a total post-emergence program to control our weeds, we were really looking at that residual application of herbicides, and multiple times, whether it's in crop or across the winter, really differs based on the weed and cropping system.
Right. So, Rachel, this is sort of thinking about the weed control well ahead of actually getting the crop in the ground, and making sure that we've got weed control that's perhaps sticking around through that early part of that season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it highlights a really good point in that it's kind of a shift in mindset when it comes to herbicide programs, because, we, I think kind of found ourselves in a place where it was sort of like see weed, spray weed, kill weed. And with the soil applied herbicides, we have to be planning, we have to be documenting, we have to be thinking about where we have the patches that we need to be planning for, because we're applying these herbicides prior to any visible weed growth. It's all happening before they come out of the ground. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that to me, so you're right. I think, the mindset has always sort of been, you want to make sure that you get those weeds, so you want them to emerge so that you actually hit them. But realistically, you're only going in then with one pass on emerged weeds. How long does that pass actually last you? And frankly, it's not that long. So this is where sort of that, with those flushing weeds, you could be making multiple passes, etc. Okay, so but that brings up a few different points, and this is one of the things that we've got a slide for, is on that critical weed-free period. And producer Jay, I think it's Rachel's slide 1. The question of, why is early weed control not just a key part of potentially controlling some of these tough to kill or tough to control weeds, but why is it so important that we have our crops set off to the best start? So Rachel, walk us through, which crops are really the most important, but why that critical weed free period is maybe so broad or so narrow for some.
Yeah. I mean, so just to sort of back up a second, critical weed free period, it's kind of a self-explanatory term. It's that period that a crop needs to remain weed free in order to prevent any yield loss. And so typically, and Joe, maybe you'd be even better person to comment on this, but when you look at the research that's done, oftentimes we're using like a 5 to 10% threshold as sort of, that yield benefit. So that's what you're seeing on that right-hand column. And so just to kind of call out, what is that metric of how much yield loss is acceptable, essentially, right? And so if you walk through some of the common crops that we grow in Western Canada, starting at the top there with peas, that critical weed-free period being 7 to 14 days after emergence. Um, and that was, looking at pea yields that declined by 7% after 2 weeks, 12% after 3 weeks, and then 26% after 4 weeks. So a huge drop in yield by the time you get 4 weeks out after emergence. With wheat, that's a pretty competitive crop, relatively speaking. We're growing wheat typically on narrow row spacing. It fills in faster. And so that critical weed-free period being probably a little bit shorter, looking at that 1 to 3 leaf stage to prevent yield loss of 5%. With canola, it's funny, I think we think of canola as being maybe a more robust crop, but, researchers found that its critical weed-free period is up to the 4 leaf stage. So it's actually pretty, a narrow window as well to prevent a 10% yield loss. Soybeans, V3, V4, depending on, the work that's been done either in Ontario or in North Dakota to maintain a yield loss less than 5%. And, we know that can be influenced things by row spacing based on work that Dr. Rob Golden has done here at the University of Manitoba. Corn, another sensitive crop to weed competition. So that's one that has a fairly lengthy critical weed-free period. Corn is very sensitive to weeds, and it is a little bit, yeah.
It is, yeah.
And so,
Yeah, I'm
lots of
surprised it's
variability
that
out there.
wide. Yeah, I'm
Mm-hmm.
surprised. Yeah. Now, okay, so Joe, where would edible beans fit in here?
Oh, they're gonna need a longer weed-free period than something like soybean. So they're
Okay.
they're pretty responsive. I mean, weed competition can really cause yield loss on dry beans. So I don't have the data off the top of my head on where exactly that is, but I think I'd probably just like to go back a little bit. And to me, it's always great to hear a concept from two different people because it really drives it home to you really well. And so I'm just amazed. I'm looking at this slide. I'm thinking that's the blood, sweat, and tears of probably 20 graduate students from 30 to 40 undergraduate
Right?
students. If you think about how we have to conduct these trials, so we'll plant a trial. If we look at corn, I'm going to pick on that one being on the bottom row. So we'll plant corn, and then we figure out the front end of that curve by basically letting weeds grow and then starting to remove them at certain growth stages. In the back end, we have a separate trial. We kind of keep it weed free, and then let the weeds grow after a certain point. And so basically, we're saying that if you're counting the leaf tip method on corn, that if you get to 3 leaf corn and have not removed your weeds, you're starting to see some yield loss. And then basically, if you can get through 10 leaf corn weed free, then the weeds that come up afterwards, they're not going to matter as much for yield for that crop. And so I'm amazed at looking at how much data can be packed into one slide, and having conducted these trials, that's a lot of work there.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Thank you for
and
that.
a reason
That is,
why that it doesn't happen, it doesn't get repeated a lot, right? Like once we have that information, it's not something that I think a lot of people are eager
that's right.
get out there and replicate again.
Yeah, once we have it, it's like let's not do this work again. Let's just focus here. Okay, so Peter Johnson, who did a great job last week hosting, so hats off to you, Peter. So his question is part of herbicide layering strategy the attempt to never let the target weed get too big because small weeds are easier to kill, fewer growing points, etc. Joe, is it about the weed size or never, or is it more about having that residual that holds on through that critical weed free period more?
The way that we typically discuss it is more you don't want the weeds to come up. And so I guess you could call that size dependent, but that's probably not what Peter's actually asking. So for us, we want to make sure we have additional residual herbicide so that we're killing those weeds as they emerge, or just never let them really emerge. And so that's certainly the way that we utilize the terminology.
Okay. Rachel, how would you approach that question? Is it about not or trying to get ahead of them, or is it really avoiding that germinating weed ever sort of breaking the surface?
I think it's both, right? it's about you're setting the stage. I think in Ontario, they talk about 2-pass programs, or in Australia, they talk about a double knock program for herbicide control. And it's kind of the same philosophy, right? Where we're thinning the herd in order to allow that next application, whether it's a burn off or it's your in crop, to have better coverage of the plant, of that weed, and therefore better control of that next herbicide pass that you're going to be making. But certainly it starts with just killing the ones, as many as we can, before we even get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to, and we can talk about some products as well, and we've got some really great schematics too, to sort of look at time of year, etc. But I'm thinking back, and I'm going to claim, while I may be relatively senior to some, I consider myself still pretty early in my career in this one. But there was a shift not that long ago that really did, because we used to use far more soil applied, or we used more residual, and then it seemed like we shifted away from those products, and now they're on vogue again. So Rachel, maybe I'll start with you. What do you think has driven that shift of sort of coming back to some of these residuals?
Glyphosate resistant kochia. It's probably the number one. It seems to, just be keeping up. Kochia in general, it seems to be keeping up with whatever herbicide programs are a la mode. And so, it started with group 2 resistance when the group 2s came out before my time. And now we've gotten to a place now where, we're putting more emphasis on the 14s and 15 chemistries to try and manage those weeds.
Mm-hmm. Joe, same question to you. Why do you think we've sort of moved to this point?
Yeah, I'll just say resistance to post-emergence herbicides in general. So whenever I talk about layering herbicides or utilizing residuals, anyone in the audience who was farming before, I'll just say 1990, it's like, oh, so we're going back to that, huh? So that's whether it's at planting or just utilizing that chemistry, because we often are going back to the future and using some of the older chemistry to control these weeds. And we kind of had a golden era. We'll call it the mid 90s to, depending on where you're at, mid 2000s. Not just glyphosate within Roundup Ready soybean and Roundup Ready corn, but the Group 1 and Group 2 herbicides and small grains. So very effective post-emergence chemistry, and it really did make weed control relatively easy. So very effective chemistry, very forgiving, that kind of helped hide some application sins along the way, maybe, can control weeds larger than we really should be spraying. And then now we have resistance to those different chemistries, whether it's glyphosate resistant kochia or water hemp, or group 1 and 2 resistant foxtail. We have to go back to the residual chemistries to control them. And so in many ways, we're kind of not reinventing the wheel, but we're polishing the wheel we still have, and trying to figure out how we can make these things work again. And it's kind of a re-education for some, and maybe a brand new education for others who started farming after that time frame.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we've got some great questions that speak to, are we talking about putting these products on in the spring? Are we talking about putting them on in the fall? Are we talking about post-emerge? And the answer is, well, it depends, and perhaps yes to all of them. So that we are going to cover that. Producer Jay, though, I want to go to the clip with Lyle Jensen, because one of the key questions, so this is a Pulse School episode with Lyle, talking about targeting weeds in the fall, and planning for that spring residual, and then thinking about that moisture equation, because this is always a big one, especially in some of those very dry areas. And I see that Farmer Jim, with his kochia seasonal depression, is on. He farms near Lancer, Saskatchewan, where it is very, very dry. And so there is always this question of moisture and how much is enough, and can we use these products in dry areas? So Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to the Lyle Jensen clip, the Pulse School, please.
This field, as you can see, is cereal stubble. This would be like a target field that we would be going into pulses next year. So we're going to be looking for, certain weed species that would give us problems in pulses, mainly things like kochia and Russian thistles, as well as wild oats.
So are you mostly going after the perennials at this point?
At this point, for fall control, that's the best time to take care of your perennial weeds, whether it's things like foxtail, downy brome, or Canada thistle, or even quackgrass. Fall is the best time to get all of those under control.
Now, when you're watching, daylight hours are going down, so of course your herbicide efficacy is going to change there too. Talk a bit about the weather and how that impacts fall weed control.
Yeah, well, with the lower daytime temperatures, to some degree it can help with some of the weeds that were previously hardened off by, 35, 36 degrees Celsius daytime highs. Like kochia was pretty much almost impossible to kill for quite some time there now. But now it's getting a little bit easier, but with the temperatures being lower, it does take a lot longer for visual symptoms to appear. So it can, sometimes be 2 to 3 weeks after application before you can tell whether you're going to have mortality or not.
Now, pulses are famously known for their lack of competitiveness. Talk about how important it is that there is a clean field when they're coming up in the spring.
Oh, it is extremely important. In most pulses, our weed control options in crop are especially limited, usually to a group 2 for broadleaf weed control. So really it's essential that you go into those fields clean in the spring, and a lot of that comes down to proper weed control in the fall. Typically with the group 14, 15 chemicals that we kind of rely on for, fall and spring residual weed control in the pulses, we're going to be trying to apply those as close to freeze up as possible in order to kind of maximize that long-term residual in the spring.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are the Canola School, FMC Pre-School, and RealAg on the Weekend. In partnership with Rolco Radio in Saskatoon, Real Agriculture is pleased to present RealAg on the Weekend with host Sean Haney. Listen live on Saturdays at 4 p.m. in Saskatchewan at 650 CKOM Saskatoon and 980 CJME Regina. Or find it on realagriculture.com, cjme.com, ckom.com, or as a podcast download.
All right, so shout out actually. So Peter Johnson said that's Kara Oosterhouse. Her voice on there. Her name is now Kara Mastel, Peter, and it's her birthday today. So happy birthday, Kara. So there you go. That's my birthday present to you, Kara. All right. So a few things, and there's some great questions that have come in as well in talking about seed return, etc. But let's back up a step and talk about, so we're talking about, we have fall applied but spring activated products, right? So that is perhaps a bit of a mind shift for some people. So Joe, I'll go to you first. Is that a difficult thing to sort of wrap your head around, that you're going to put something on the fall that's going to work in the spring? And how big of a question is that moisture question?
Right, and I liked that clip as the lead into this because there's a lot to unpack there, which is probably the daily motto of any agronomist. That's why I like the name of this podcast, because it's not always we're just going after kochia. That clip they were talking about perennials and kochia, and so we're often talking about some complex tank mixtures for these fall applications, and each product we throw in the tank is doing something different. So if we're going after a perennial, we might have glyphosate in the tank. That won't have any residual for us into the spring, but that's in there for the quackgrass or whatever other perennial we're going after. So the other question that we will often get is the timing of this fall application for residual. And so the date is going to vary by geography and when winter actually arrives, but our general rule of thumb is if we're applying a residual herbicide sometime in September, that's something to go after for fall residual for our winter annual weeds that are emerging in the fall. So if we have something like mare's tail, Canada fleabane, once I cross the border, narrowleaf hawksbeard, we might want some residual in the fall to get some of those, and that's what that September residual is for. But if we're going after kochia or spring emerging weeds, we hold that residual off as long as we can, basically right until the ground freezes, because we don't want that to really be incorporated until we have some snow melt and rainfall earlier in the spring, and really get that into the soil, because we don't want it to start degrading before we enter winter. And so the timing of that residual often will differ based on your goals. But for this, we're probably talking kochia, and so that's get that residual on in the fall. It's probably going to just about sit there all winter, and then we use that snow melt rainfall in the spring to catch the early flushes of kochia.
All right, so Rachel, I'll go to you on this one, and producer Jay, if you would, I think it's slide 2 of Rachel's, our diagram that, okay. So this is sort of what we're talking about. So Rachel, so similar question, but with some visuals, how late are we going on in the fall if we're thinking about putting on these products exactly that for our spring flush of weeds?
Sorry, do we want to go to slide 3 maybe, producer
Sure.
Jay?
Yeah, we can
I feel like
there.
that might
there we go.
sort of
Yes. Okay.
flow
Awesome.
the conversation a little bit better.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I think Joe nailed it, right? That's exactly, how I would be having a conversation with a farmer around timing of fall application. The active ingredients in FMC's portfolio, peroxysulfone, sulfentrazone, being probably the top 2 that we talk about. They break down through microbial breakdown, and so the rule of thumb I usually use is like trying to target like that 10 to 12 degrees Celsius soil temperature, just sort of being a general rule of thumb that's going to be when microbial breakdown slows. And so to put a calendar date on that, again, it's going to be really dependent, but kind of in that early to mid-October is usually when we see those applications start to happen. But for us, and thinking back to the region that I cover, one of the things that we talk about a lot at FMC is just trying to maintain that even layer of that herbicide on the soil surface. And so think about it in terms of timing as like after you've done, any of your fall harrowing, after your anhydrous applications, we want this to be like the last pass on your field before you, winterize that sprayer for the year.
Okay. So there was a question earlier about tillage. So that's sort of one of the other questions of, depending on the product that you're using, is there, Joe, maybe I'll ask that one of you. When it comes to tillage and using some of these products, what do we need to navigate there?
Yeah, so most of the research that's gone behind this has been in a no-till system. Because that's a system where we don't have that spring tillage pass to clean up these weeds. But we have started to look at some of these herbicides in different tillage systems. And I'm just going to echo exactly what Rachel says. When we make these applications, we want it to be the last thing we do in the fall. And so for some folks in a more conventional tillage system for us, that means you have done some sort of maybe a chisel plow or some other pass in the fall, get the herbicide on, and then what we've seen with products like pyroxasulfone, group 15 herbicide, or flumioxazin, a group 14 herbicide, some ones that are less water soluble. When we come back and do our finished pass in the spring, that's usually just kind of getting us ready for planting. That spring pass usually doesn't affect the performance of that fall residual. But that's usually, I think every time we've done that, we've applied after that fall tillage operation has taken place. Because what we don't want to do is dilute that herbicide within the soil profile, because then any additional moisture, we're already diluted in the soil, so we're starting to break that down and maybe push it below the germination depth of the weeds that we're actually targeting, which in many cases are shallow seeded weeds, especially when we think about kochia.
Right. So, okay, and now Mark is asking, and this is, so we do have obviously an audience across Canada. We've got a lot of Ontario people that, it's a different world in a lot of ways. This winter doesn't feel as different. It's been darn cold for a while. But with let's say an earlier spring or higher moisture, that's, I guess, my question. Rachel, I'm guessing you deal with a lot of low moisture situations. But how do these products work in high moisture situations? Do we worry about them actually being effective if there's too much moisture?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that definitely has come up. Thinking about Red River Valley, we were flooding 2 years ago here, so I think generally speaking, the fall applications, not that they don't fit our cropping systems as well in the Red River Valley. I think that there's still an opportunity, but looking back at that just that graphic there, I like the fall application for our early seeded crops because I think we want to set them up so that we're getting that crop established and putting in, getting that benefit out of that residual control as soon as possible. For our row crops, soybeans, sunflowers, I like to line up that timing closer to when that crop is getting going. So just to kind of back that up. But then in terms of, the question around excess moisture with these, soil applied herbicides, I think that, they are at risk of moving, some more than others. And so, ideally, we're not going to be applying them to fields in the fall that we know every year they're going to be underwater. I don't think that that's a good stewardship practice. So that's just something that probably needs to be part of the consideration around how and where and when do we fit these products into our rotations.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jason Voigt's got a great question. So Jason is in largely Red River Valley, other areas of Manitoba as well, but
Hi,
saying he's
Jason.
a great, yes, I'm sure you know each other. And Dr. Joe, you might know him too. We've had great success with dicamba as a pre before soybeans emerge for kochia and other annuals, but with more water hemp around, should we be delaying that dicamba to early, post, or even later? Dr. Joe, maybe I'll go to you on this one first. Any thoughts on that system?
Yeah, well, Jason, like any good Jedi, always asks good questions. So for those who know Jason, make sure I'm paying attention here.
Indeed, yes.
So what we have seen within our research is within soybeans specifically, we actually have seen quite a good benefit of having that dicamba within the residual application at planting, and so we actually, well, once we get that water hemp up to 2 or 3 inches tall, I'm just going to speak in inches for now. So 5 to 7
Fine.
centimeters,
We
whatever.
understand them. It's okay. We got it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Then that's really when we start seeing a breaking point where control will stop. So what we have seen is having that dicamba in the residual application has really been beneficial. It's not going to carry the load in a dry year. I guess maybe it will. It's a very water soluble herbicide, so it looks better residual wise in a dry year. But it's a really complementary piece of a residual herbicide program. So pick something, one of your favorite products in soybean that you are used to, 2, maybe 3 effective active ingredients, have the dicamba in there, and we can be 90 to 95% water hemp free 6 weeks after planting. We've seen that with dicamba added to our typical soybean herbicide programs for a number of years in our trials. Water hemp
Okay.
specifically, I'm talking.
Yep. Right. Okay. So, and these are, thank you for answering this, because these are really great questions of how do we use not just the products we have, but the genetics that we have and some of our tolerance traits. How do we best use them to leverage, what that crop can do for our weed control as well? But I don't know that we have, perfect answers, but we're certainly learning, especially as the weed spectrum changes as well, right? So now I wanted to touch on one thing that was also mentioned that Peter, I think, pointed out, that we were talking about the critical weed-free period. We were talking about the potential of yield loss. But there is, of course, as we talk about some of these really nasty weeds like kochia, water hemp, Palmer amaranth, etc., there's also this question of weed seed return. So weeds that, of course, are perhaps outside of that yield eating zone may still potentially be a problem. Rachel, I know that maybe doesn't fit in the, soil residual early control, but how do you tackle the question of, trying to decrease the amount of weed seeds that get returned to the seed bank?
I think it absolutely fits into this conversation. I mean, I think that's probably, again, part of that change of mindset that we are seeing in weed science. I see that conversation is being had around, terms like parking lot weed control in parts of the southern U.S. And, it's that shift when we're managing herbicide resistant weeds that we need to have such an effective weed control program that we're not allowing any of that population to contribute to next year's problem, right? And so I think it just points to the fact that our herbicide programs are going to get more complex, not less complex. And we're going to have to become even better at managing weeds to try and draw down these populations as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Joe, obviously, I mean, with a residual product, I mean, we want it to last a while, but we don't want it to persist so long that it ends up being a headache for, maybe next year's crop or whatever. So same question or similar question approaching that, we talk about revenge spraying sometimes, right? Where you've gone out that weed's already done the yield damage it's going to do, but are there still reasons that we potentially could be going out there to control some of these weeds, or at least try, because of the weed seed return?
Well, that's the $1 million question I get asked every July and August. Really, I mean, this is where the pigweeds thrive, and I'm talking specifically water hemp and palmer amaranth. And this audience, I'm guessing, will mostly be a water hemp market. But those weeds are very, very interesting from a biological perspective, where the seed that is produced, it really doesn't matter when that parent plant germinated. That seed will germinate when the conditions are right and if there's an open canopy. And so I'm going to be long-winded on this answer because I've done a lot of work on it and pretty passionate about it. And it's very intriguing to me. So if I look at something like wheat, so I get this question quite a bit. We can generally get water hemp free wheat crop in, spring wheat crop. Then we take it off and we get a rainfall event and we get a large flush of water hemp that will only get about 3 inches tall, produce 100 seed maybe per plant. And the question will be, well, that plant emerged in August, went to seed in September, so that's a late summer emerger, right? No, we can oftentimes take that seed and it's going to be ready to germinate and go for our crop the next year. And so this is why a lot of my colleagues will talk about a zero tolerance for seed production policy with water hemp and palmer amaranth, because any seed that's produced is just going to go ahead and be a problem for us the following year. And so when we're thinking about in-crop layering residual herbicides, really our goal for something like soybean is to get that residual at planting, get it again in crop, and we need that crop canopy to take over and shade out the soil to prevent further germination. Otherwise, those plants will germinate throughout the year. And so that's kind of one piece of that puzzle. The revenge sprays, that's where it becomes kind of, oftentimes when I'm getting questions about revenge sprays, you're not going to actually kill the weed. You're going to ding your crop some. And so if it makes you feel good and you've got an unlimited budget, I guess you can go for it as long as you're not breaking the law. But oftentimes you're not killing that weed. If there's seed heads already present, that seed is already going to be viable. And so it is just kind of an exercise and throwing some money at a field. It may make us feel better, make it look cleaner, but they often don't do a lot of good when it comes to something like water hemp or cleaning up water hemp late in the season.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is you need a lot of summer students to go and hand pick those plants and have bonfire.
Well, I mean
It's an
something
option.
I will often mention. It's what do we have in the '80s that we don't have now? Bean bars and a lot of people walking fields, and so cleaning up those late season weeds and something like soybean is just not something we want to walk fields and do anymore. And that's where some things like water hemp tend to fill in that niche and really thrive.
Yeah. Nature is fascinating. The question here, our moosehead is the name that comes up for me. Has dicamba been discontinued? I think I know what you're talking about. No. However, Minnesota, I believe, has an over-the-top dicamba. I don't want to call it a ban, but they are not allowing it. Minnesota, I'm just looking at the news here that came across just last week. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture saying that over-the-top dicamba products are not available for use in Minnesota for 2025. So just keep that in mind. Joe, what are things like around where you are?
Yeah, so this will be a U.S. specific answer.
Yes, yep.
When we talk about the utility or use of dicamba, usually we're talking about Ingenia, XtendiMax, Tavium, or the three labeled products that we can use in Extend or XtendFlex soybean. Cotton for anyone who's growing cotton and listening. Those are not labeled for this year, so we do not have the ability to spray dicamba in those crops pre-emergence or over the top. Older formulations that we can utilize in corn, small grains, pastures, those are still labeled and perfectly fine. And it is a very specific use to those products that are legal to use in Extend, soybean, and cotton. And I know that
Okay.
changes once we cross the international border, but that's the
Yep.
U.S. story.
Yep, that's right. Yep. So, and I mean, it's something to keep an eye on here as well, obviously, and recognize that there are changes and differences between jurisdictions. So yeah, so thanks for that, Joe. And certainly we had heard some of that, or we've watched some of that in the States as well, as to how that may change things up here. But as far as I know, as of right now, anyway, we've got the all clear. So now it is the all clear in that it is on label. It doesn't mean that it is a simple thing. Obviously, there's some stewardship things there that you need to follow the label and make sure that we're applying these products as judiciously as we can, and using all the stewardship so that we're minimizing off target movement. Obviously, okay, we're going to go. We've got a quick read here, our last read of the night, and then we're going to come back and look at. We've got some pictures to look at, and maybe a few other questions. I want to revisit the moisture and the microbial question as well. But producer Jay, if you would.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are FMC Pre-School, RealAg on the Weekend, and the Canola School. From preceding seeder setup and checks to pest ID and advice on nutrient management decisions to tips on determining swath timing, Real Agriculture's Canola School covers every facet of the canola growing season. The Canola School is made possible through sponsorship by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Learn more at canolaschool.com.
All right. So one of the things certainly in Ontario, higher moisture, longer season, so warmer, wetter climate. We still use, soil applied. We still use different products, but we do have to think about that microbial population, or we have to think about the water or the water amount and how much these breaks things down. Rachel, when you're working with growers in those very dry areas, we have had incredibly dry years. How much water do these products need to really get rolling? Is snowmelt usually sufficient, or have we seen these products really struggle in a very dry conditions?
Good question. It's probably like the number one question that comes every spring, right? Is how much water is enough? And I think, the general sort of market position with the products at FMC is 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So with the authority brands, sulfentrazone, it's a bit more water soluble. So, we're looking at, 1/2 inch. Depending on your soil type, you might get away with less. For Focus brand, that's proxysulfone, that's the group 15. It's less water soluble. And so, we're looking for more of that 1/2 inch to 1 inch of moisture. And when I say, that 1/2 inch, that's like an initial rainfall amount, right? And so with these brands, their chemistry is such that they are designed to be applied to the soil surface. And so unlike, the products, group 3s, groups 8s, where we're using steel to incorporate them because that's the way that those products need to be incorporated, we're using moisture to have that initial sort of incorporation amount. And so, you look at Western Canada and all the different soil types that we have, it really can depend. I think that those semi-arid areas, the dry soils, sandy soils, seems to me that, we can get away with maybe a little bit less moisture out there and still have really good efficacy because you have other things that are working for you, because the sands are going to have less potential to bind those herbicide active ingredients. So you have less factors that are kind of working against you, if you will, that can kind of overcome or help compensate for that reduced moisture amounts. Over in our heavy clay soils, lots of binding potential for those soils. So we need to be, upping our rates. And, we want to see, probably more moisture. Subsequent moisture events going to be really important for maintaining that herbicide activity in the soil as well, because that's how, I think once you kind of wrap your head around, like, that's how the herbicide actually gets to where it needs to go, right, is with moisture. So, it's two-pronged, right? The first is we want to just move it down. It's the physical movement of that herbicide down to the soil layer where those germinating weed seeds are. And then the second part of that is we need subsequent moisture events in order to keep it in soil solution so that it can physically get into that weed seed, which is what we're trying to target. And so, so some different variables there to consider, I guess.
So Jason wants to know, Rachel, or he says you should also talk about when you get way more rainfall and what happens. So what does happen, Rachel?
Well, that's a great question. I think with excess rainfall, what can happen is that it moves. These things are not stable; they're not static, and so that they can move down into the soil profile, into the root zone now of our germinating crop. And so the concern that we can sometimes face is that if that rainfall comes when that crop is very shallow, the root system is very shallow in the crop, it's a young plant, its metabolism just gets overdone with the herbicide activity that's getting drawn in. And so, because that's the basis of selectivity with these products, right, is metabolism driven. So, but we also rely on a little bit of spatial separation between where that herbicide layer is to where that germinating crop seed is. And so too much rain when the crop is young, under some different soil conditions, can produce a crop response that's usually temporary. Yeah.
Okay. Forewarned is forearmed.
Forewarned. Yeah, absolutely.
There you go. Right, Peter? Forearmed. Anyway, but it's with an E, so it's not having forearm. Okay, anyway. All right, so let's actually, Rachel, while you mentioned that, and Joe, I'll go to you on this one. Let's go back to then slide 2, I think, where we do talk about sort of what's in soil solution. And so Joe, just walk me through sort of, this is that so as Rachel explains, we want this product to get moved into the very top of the soil, but then we do need moisture to keep it in soil solution so that those germinating seeds are actually taking this up. So if you could just sort of explain why this works well for some of these weeds that we're trying to target.
Right, and so Rachel hit all the high points already, but the other thing that we'll often talk about is that herbicide we are using, is it absorbed by the root or the shoot of the weed or a plant, I should say. And so that can become a lot more nuanced. So that's a whole nother hour or two if we really want to get into that one. We'll often talk about.
Rachel loves this topic, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so
yeah.
Some of our shoot absorbed herbicides, we don't want those to be pushed too deep, and some of those might be our more water soluble products. So we want the weeds to germinate and emerge through them. And that's how they absorb them. Then they'll die before we ever really see them. We do have some of our products that are absorbed by the root, and those would need to be deeper. But in general, that's just kind of some more background there. The weeds we're really targeting will typically emerge in that top inch of the soil. And when we do this fall applied situation, we're generally getting that herbicide distributed throughout that part of the profile. So we are getting root and shoot absorption in most cases. The other thing that's maybe not as apparent on the screen, these questions that I'll get every year, I get drought questions and then flooding questions. Back to Jason's point, May 13th of this year, I was taking drought questions. May 20th, it was Chicken Little. The sky was falling. We were flooded, and my herbicide I applied was gone. But in a drought situation, what this figure lists, I'm just kind of looking at it for the first time. I'm not seeing where these herbicide particles will be absorbed to the soil, and we'll need additional rainfall events to wash it off the soil particles back into that soil solution, like Rachel mentioned, to be absorbed. And so that's what this cartoon is really kind of showing, is that we need it to be moved into the soil, into the right spot of the soil to control the weeds. And then that's when we get the absorption by the weeds and then ultimately death.
Right. And so it is possible that, like, for some of these, we may never see them emerge, right? If it's working as it should, we should see fewer. Rachel, from your experience, do you still see, some emergence, but they're sickly? What does this look like when it's working?
So with the group 14s, light is obligatory for the reaction to occur in the plant. And so they will come out onto the soil surface. So it's usually just at that cotyledon stage that they will then react. You'll see the cells rupture and the plants will die. So if you're there with looking very closely, you can see those symptoms. Typically, when we're scouting, we're seeing the symptoms further out, and maybe it's you're starting to see some of the plants that are growing through it. With the group 15s, those are shoot inhibitors really at their core, and so in that case, you might have to move some soil back because that plant will be sort of just below the soil surface to find those symptoms of plant death. So they are tricky to scout for, but once you kind of calibrate your eye and know what you're looking for, you can find symptoms of these products working.
Okay. I would be one of those people out digging. I'll be honest, Rachel. It sounds really cool. Anyway, especially if it's a weed I don't like, then yeah, like cleavers or kochia, then yeah, I'd like to see it suffer. So that's okay too. Okay, so that and we're coming to the end of our time here, and this has been absolutely fascinating, and so I thank you both, and thank you everyone for your great questions. Like to me, this is again, and I know we use the term maybe too much, another tool in the toolbox kind of idea, but this conversation of whether it's fall weed control, fall applied, spring residual products, over the top, pre and post. Joe, when we think about like planning out our weed control, how key is it that we take the time to make it a complex weed management plan? Maybe not complicated, but complex.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of say knowledge is the number one tool we have in that toolbox, and so it really does come to you need to know the fields you're working in and the weeds you're dealing with, and I've complex. I mean, we're at the point with some of these weeds. Look, you're gonna have fields that you can still relatively control the weeds with ease, and I think every agronomist listening knows those fields. I'm not worried about that one, right? But I've got this field. And sometimes these are the fun questions. Fun as in if you want to really stretch your brain. I've got kochia and ragweed and water hemp and wild oat, and what do I do? And oftentimes there's not a straight chemistry answer for that, particularly if you want to lock yourself into certain crops. So we haven't really spent a whole lot of time on crop rotation, but that's also a very big piece that some of these fields you may have a certain weed by crop that if chemistry is your main hammer in the toolbox, you're in a no-win situation. You're not going to be able to control those weeds. So it's certainly looking at it in a whole comprehensive fashion. Certain areas of the country and countries listening, cover crops are an additional tool we haven't talked about that can be part of this mixture. Adds to the complexity. I always say that there's a reason the word crop is in cover crop. It's not something you throw out there and it just takes care of things. But as we get into some of these weeds that are very problematic, or some of these situations, very common for me, a water, hemp, and kochia field. If we're just talking layering residual herbicides, that's at least 3 applications of soil residual, often at a price point people don't really want to spend, particularly in certain years when commodity prices aren't high. And so we need to really get into these complex ways of thinking and really trying to attack these weeds. And the main reason, again, going back to some of these weeds with the resistance we have, in some of our crops, we don't have the post-emergence options to control them anymore. And it's that kind of drives necessity when the easy button goes away and we still want to control these weeds because it's profitable ground. We need to start looking at these more complex situations. So it's nothing anyone really wants to do. Everyone wants to make everything easy and get rid of weed control. That's easy. Focus on all the other issues we have to deal with in agronomy. But some of these fields kind of drive necessity for us.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, similar question, but sort of adding that layer of context of cropping choice, exactly that. When it comes to these products, if you've applied them in the fall, are you locked in to a narrower, cropping system as far as what your choices are? How do you make that call of that balance of whether or not you're limited come spring?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the product, you are going to be constrained to registered crops in the spring. And so I think that's part of where the planning with your, as a farmer, as agronomists who are listening in, that's where the proactive approach comes in, right? We're sitting down, we're identifying those problem fields that we want to incorporate some of these more, heavy duty packages on, and making those decisions ahead of time. So, that is something that needs to be considered. And I just want to echo, like, I wrote down here in my notes, we didn't even get there. We didn't even get to the second page of my notes here. But just to think about, competitive crops as a mode of action, right? Like that's
right.
It cannot be, we're spending a lot of time, and obviously I'm here representing a manufacturer, but like we cannot, ignore that, because I think it's so important. And what I love to see is the incorporation of these residual herbicides in with our cover crops and our winter annual crops, and like fitting everything together, because we can't silo these concepts. They have to be brought together if we're going to be successful. So
I love that. Yes. Thank you, Rachel. And that is, it's a key part. It's a key challenge of hosting this show, of trying to choose a topic and keeping it to an hour, because we could, we could cover these things several times over. But I appreciate that, Rachel, and I think we've even got a story on Real Agriculture that talks about crop rotation as a mode of action, right? So we have so many cultural controls that, do add to this equation. And it's the cumulative impact of all these different decisions that we make, not just that single one that's going to be the one hammer that solves everything. Now, Pete also said 3 applications of soil applied herbicide to control kochia and water hemp. How long before we have resistance to soil applied herbicides? It's one point I want to touch on, and I know you're not saying we should all go out and do that, but what are the risks, the relative risk of resistance developing to these products? There was a time when we said, glyphosate was going to be difficult to have resistance to, and actually no. So what is our feeling as far as, obviously stewardship of these products and the relative risk compared to maybe some others?
Well, yeah, some areas we're already there. We already have resistance to some of these residuals. It's, when we talk about resistance to residuals, it's actually a very difficult thing to initially detect and then confirm. Because a lot of times, if we have a failure, oh, that was environmental. It didn't rain too much. Something else happened. That's why that residual failed. But certainly, when we focus on water hemp or palmer amaranth, we have resistance to our residual herbicides. I'm not saying within North Dakota or the prairies, but other areas of the U.S. we certainly have resistance, and part of that we have found is actually linked to metabolic resistance. That some of the resistance to residuals we've discovered is because we found resistance first to a foliar herbicide. And so that's, again, a whole nother hour or two. I don't have till midnight, but we get into that complex of, when we talk about metabolic or non-target site resistance, we could often, by evolving resistance to one active ingredient, have resistance to 5 different sites of action, just based on how different chemicals get metabolized within that plant, and sometimes they are residuals. So it is certainly a risk. It's certainly something that I think about quite often, because the easy thing to discuss for large audiences is effective chemistry to control our weeds. It's so, by and large, the cheapest way to get maximum weed control is through chemistry. So it's the easiest thing to talk about. But in my perspective, we do need to bring all these other things into the operation, because we're not going to spray our way out of herbicide resistance. I think we've proven that.
Yeah. And thanks, Peter, for this one. But there's always somebody who says, well, weeds don't get resistant to steel. Okay, that's not entirely true either. So yeah, so again, we could do a whole show on that. But someone also asked what was the cheapest way to deal with Palmer. Mark, thank you for your answer of the night. Fire. That would be the cheapest way to deal with Palmer amaranth. There you go. So I don't think anybody's hey, we've got weed zappers. Maybe we can use weed zappers. Anyway, I do know that we'll, of course, come up with all sorts of inventive ways to manage these things because so long as we have crops, we've got weeds. So, Joe, Rachel, thank you both so much. This was incredibly informative, a lot of fun, and yes, so much more to discuss on this topic, but a great start at least. So, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And for everyone joining us, of course, live, thank you so much for your questions and your comments. We'll be back not next week. So next week is Family Day, Louis Riel Day, depending on where you are in Canada. So no show on the 17th, but we will be back on the 24th. We're talking ultra early seeding. And so, yeah, check back the 24th, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you then. Cheers, everybody.